Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us this morning for the applicant webinar for the EPA Research Call 2025. You're all very welcome, and I'd also like to welcome my co-presenters, Damien Keeley and Eamon McMullen from Smith and Williamson. Just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover during this morning's webinar, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the EPA research programme to give you an idea of the kind of objectives that we're trying to achieve through the research funding that we're providing through this call. I'll be looking at the EPA Research Call 2025, so just telling you a little bit about the structure of the call and how maybe it compares to previous calls. Then we'll look at some of the nuts and bolts of the submission and evaluation process, some guidance on the application process, and then I'll be passing over to Damien, who'll talk us through some of the details around our financial rules and eligibility requirements. And then, as said, at the end, we'll be having a Q&A session, and I'd ask you to submit your questions via the Q&A function in Teams. So to kick off, I just want to speak a little bit and quite briefly around our research framework, EPA Research 2030. So this is our strategy going out to 2030. And really it's about recognising the role that science and innovation play in environmental protection. There's a very strong focus in the EPA research programme on how we can inform policy and that's the development of policy and the implementation, and particularly in the area of the environment, climate and sustainability, but also how we bring together the researchers and research users to make sure that that research is actionable and impactful in that policy context. We have an agile, responsive and flexible programme, and I hope that will come through as I discuss the structure of this year's call in comparison to last year's call and how we're trying to address the different needs of the different stakeholders that we engage with. In addition to the EPA research call, which is the focus of this discussion this morning, in this session this morning, we also have other funding mechanisms and partnerships, be they national partnerships with other funding agencies, as well as international partnerships with EU funding programmes. And we also put a very strong emphasis on knowledge transfer and how we can proactively facilitate that between the research community and the policy community. So what are the objectives, more specifically, of EPA Research 2030? Well, we want to deliver impactful research that's usable by our end users. That should be timely evidence that can support that policy and decision making. Our research should try to identify or try to address identify knowledge gaps, and I'll speak a little bit about this in the context of this year's call in a few minutes. And it should also do things like support relevant implementation actions in policy, as well as behavioural change interventions. Another really important aspect of our programme is to enhance national environmental research capacity, and that's both through supporting positions within the research community, but also enhancing the capacity for knowledge transfer and that engagement between the research community and the policy community. And then finally, there's an overall objective around supporting all of the EPA's functions, as well as delivering open knowledge and data solutions. We have a kind of an integrated thematic approach, and again, you'll see this as you look through our documentation around the call. We divide our research into 4 interconnected hubs. They cover a very wide area of research, from climate change evidence needs through green and circular economy, healthy environment, and also the natural environment. While we divide things in these hubs, we also recognise that they're very interconnected, cross-sectoral. So you'll also see that we have some cross-cutting topics in this year's call. If you want to find out more about our hubs, I'd recommend that maybe you look at our current set of thematic priorities, which cover the years 2024 to 2026, and they are available on our website. And they really are used to frame a lot of the research actions of the EPA research programme. And for example, the topics in this year's call are framed around those priorities. Before we actually get into the call itself, I mean, why should you apply to the EPA? I mean, I suppose one of the primary drivers will likely be about bringing your skills, your expertise. This is why we have a research call, to bear on identified knowledge gaps in the area of climate, environment, and sustainability. And there's a real opportunity for your research to have impact, and quite direct impact on really important areas that have been identified at a national level. We provide you with lots of support to do that. So we proactively support you to develop and transfer actionable knowledge. And this is through things like we put in place steering committees for every funded project with policymakers who provide advice, guidance, support, access to data, context in how your research can be impactful, what those outputs might be that might be most relevant to their needs, and how you can develop actionable recommendations that can be taken up by the end users. So that, I suppose, leads me on to that engagement with policy actors relevant to your research, but also that in a broader sense to broaden your network of the research community, but also that policy making community to, again, enhance the quality of your research. And I suppose ultimately you'll have the opportunity, as I said at the outset, to inform and impact climate, environmental and sustainability policy through your engagement in the EPA research programme. This year's call looks slightly different to last year's call. In recent years, we've undergone quite a lot of consultation, or undertaken quite a lot of consultation with both the research community as well as the policy community. Last year, we had a very open call to really address the needs of the research community, allowing for very innovative projects to come in, longer projects to support PhD students, and that longer term research with also that longer term outlook. This year's call will be looking at more focused projects. We've identified these through significant engagement with the policymaking community. And so this year's call is focused on smaller projects, shorter in duration and smaller in scale. The specific objectives, again, similar to our overall objectives, are to address knowledge gaps and policy priorities relevant to the environment, climate and sustainability. And as I mentioned, these have been identified through an engaged research process of engaging with our stakeholders before we go to launch our call. But also, as I mentioned, this should support capacity building, and particularly in that area of research to policy. We're hoping to support that capacity building through this call. There's a total of 6.6 million euros available in 2025 for projects funded through the call, and I'm delighted that we have a number of co-funding partners involved. So Met Éireann, the OPW, the Office of Public Works, and the National Parks and Wildlife Service have all indicated their interest in co-funding certain topics under the call. There are 29 topics across all of our EPA research hubs, and a number of cross-cutting topics as well. They really do span a very broad range of areas, and I would really encourage people from areas maybe that aren't directly related to the environment, climate and sustainability to consider whether they may wish to see if they can flex their skills to address some of these topic areas, or also come in under interdisciplinary applications. We have, like, particularly in the area of social sciences, economics, AI, there's lots of opportunities there, and maybe people who haven't previously applied to the research call may consider an application. I would also highlight that actually in last year's call, 50% of our applicants had not previously applied to the EPA, and that was reflected in a similar kind of ratio in the funded project. So really lots of opportunities for people who haven't previously applied to us to consider an application. So now I'm going to just go through briefly the application and submission process and some key points that you should be aware of. I mean, the first thing really to make you aware of is that you should review all of our call documentation, and I would particularly highlight the technical description document as a key document that everyone should review in detail. All of the call documentation is available both on our website and also through our grant management system, Smart Simple. One thing just to note to all of you at the outset, we did an update to our technical description document yesterday. So please, if you have had previously downloaded, do look for the more up-to-date version. The update is specifically to the call topic, integrated analysis of air pollution data in Ireland, and we've provided some additional context for that particular topic, just to clarify what its objectives are and what the background of that one are. The other call documentation are guidelines, terms and conditions, the evaluation process, the online application user guide, and some frequently asked questions that are available on our website. And I'll run through some of the key aspects of these now. So the technical description document really is critical for you to review. It contains high-level information on the call, including the structure, the application process, and the content of the call. And then for each topic, you'll see that it gives the background context, the scope, and the expected outputs for that topic. So it's really critical that you review that in detail. You should also make note of the call topic identifier. That's how you're going to submit that on the grants management system, and you do need to select the correct call topic identifier when you're making your submission. And as I said, there's information on the expected outputs specific to that call topic, but please do also review the general section on expected outputs for all projects to inform your application. The guidelines, terms and conditions, this includes guidance for applicants. So do have a look at this also. It runs through the application process. It shows you how to complete the templates correctly, which is also critical, and provides you with budget and financial rules, as well as the grant award process. There's also then information for grantees on the award management process and how that's done, and on the potential outputs and deliverables. All of the T's and C's for all of our awards are also included in there. In addition, you'll see all of our policies and strategies listed there, also worth reviewing, and these cover things like the areas of IP, research integrity, freedom of information, personal information, and then open access, as well as ethical and gender issues. I will also mention an additional requirement that we've introduced this year around the use of generative AI, but I'll mention that a little bit later on. The evaluation process, I will mention again also later, but this outlines the evaluation process for eligible applications, and I would encourage all people to briefly review this, as it can be informative in how you structure your application. We have an online application portal user guide. Again, if you're having any issues engaging with our grants management system, please use this as your first reference before contacting us. But then, of course, do either contact your research office or ourselves if there's any issues that you can't resolve. And finally, we have a set of frequently asked questions. This will include responses to any technical queries that are submitted to us that we feel are relevant to all applicants to the call. So we would encourage you at various stages in advance of submitting your application just to review this to see if there's any updates on relevant to your own application. So now, just to run through the evaluation process quite quickly, just an overview of this. Please do look at the deadlines and make sure you do submit your proposal in advance of the deadline. There are two deadlines. One is for the applicant, that's the 29th of May. The other is for the authoriser, which is the 5th of June. The applicant must have submitted to the authoriser by the 29th of May. Your authoriser is, if you're in a higher education institution, will be somebody like your research office. If you're in a private sector company or similar, you'll have somebody nominated as your authoriser. One thing just to note, that after you've submitted your proposal to your authoriser for approval to the EPA, the authoriser can request revisions from you. So there is that week of time between your submission and the authoriser's submission where further revisions to the application are possible. Then we'll go on to eligibility checks, which are conducted by EPA staff, evaluation, followed by board approval by the EPA, and notifications, which will be due around October of this year, followed by negotiations, and then awarding of the grant, with research to commence then early next year. So just to run through some of those steps, the eligibility checks, as I said, are covered by or are conducted by EPA research staff members. There are a number of key issues that we'll be checking. So all applications have to be created and submitted by the lead applicant. The lead applicant has to be from an organisation located on the island of Ireland. As I mentioned earlier, you must use the correct call topic reference in your submission. You must use the correct templates that are available through the grants management system, and you must adhere to the correct maximum budget as indicated in the call documentation, as well as adherence to the maximum duration. You don't have to necessarily apply for the maximum budget or the maximum duration, but you may not exceed those. If you don't satisfy the eligibility checks, your proposal will at that stage be taken out of further consideration and won't progress to the evaluation process. So just to briefly again speak about the evaluation process, I would encourage people in advance to read our evaluation process documents so that they're aware of the criteria against which their proposals are going to be evaluated. Our evaluators are instructed to evaluate against these criteria, so do think about this when you are developing your application. We have 3 equally weighted criteria for the scientific evaluation: excellence, communication, dissemination and knowledge transfer, and then an implementation criterion also. Those will be scored and averaged across the evaluators, and we will then look at thresholds for progression to step 2, and only those proposals that meet the required thresholds will progress to the second step. The second step of the evaluation process we refer to as the national overview. This really is looking at the added value of a project in the national context, its expected impacts, and it's the potential for knowledge transfer of the proposed research, and also how the outputs will provide evidence in the context of environmental policy and other environmental considerations. The National Overview Committee will be made up of relevant members of government departments, agencies and similar policy relevant positions, and they will be really focusing on those aspects of the proposal rather than the technical aspects of the proposal that have been considered previously. So I would encourage you strongly to think about that when you're completing those aspects of the application. Past performance of principal investigators is also taken into account, and that's just looking at your compliance with reporting requirements if you've been funded previously by the EPA. So things to remember, I suppose, during the evaluation process. Think of your scientific and technical quality and also the national overview. So these are what I've just spoken about. You know, make sure you are considering that policy relevance, what kind of outputs are going to be relevant in that context, and what kind of stakeholders you should be thinking about engaging with. Do consider the technical description document very carefully. It's a critical document for you to have reviewed in advance. And also, as I mentioned, do think of that policy context of the proposal and what the policy knowledge gap you're addressing is, etc., etc. Do also think about any other ongoing work and complementarity and synergies with that. And I would advise you that we do have a searchable database of all EPA funded projects to date that's available on our website in case you want to get either a sense of the work that's been done or check for any potential synergies or overlap with work that's already being funded, but that may not have published a final report. So I suppose just to get into now how you actually go about the nuts and bolts of your application, and I will go through this quite quickly, and you may want to review the slides in a little bit more detail afterwards. So to start, do review the technical description. I know I've said this multiple times, but I really can't I suppose, emphasize how important this is. It provides you with critical background information on the scope of the topic. It provides that context, the policy relevance, the knowledge gaps, which are really important for constructing your application. And it is absolutely critical that you select the correct call topic reference in your application. And that's indicated at the very top of that topic description. For the submission, it has to be done via our grants management system, Smart Simple. If you haven't used it before, I would encourage you to register very early in the process and do engage with your research office about the process to do this. Then you should proceed with creating the draft application. And there's just a screenshot here showing you again where you need to select the correct hub and then also the correct call topic reference as indicated in the technical description document. Make sure to download the templates. If you've applied to us before, do check that you're using the up-to-date templates. Again, this is an eligibility requirement, and please do adhere to any page limits indicated in the application form. Please also don't forget that in addition to the application document that you'll complete and upload, you will have to complete a number of online fields. These are consequential, but they're also not insignificant. So do take the time to make sure you work through each of these in detail. So you'll complete some around the project scope, around the gender dimension, ethical approval, and transdisciplinarity, as well as citizen science. And then you'll also look at how you're addressing certain aspects of the call and making that justification for why your project is relevant. Again, very critical in the eligibility checks, but also in the ongoing evaluation of your proposal. I would also really try to emphasize the importance of both of these aspects. The work package summary table should be completed and should align to what you've provided in your application. So please make sure to spend some time completing that in advance of your submission, but also when it comes to the expected outputs and the impact and impact delivery sections. Again, in the context of the policy relevance, the national overview step of the application process, this is really important. So you'll be asked to provide a list of expected outputs from your proposed research and what the potential of innovation is for your proposal. In terms of the outputs, really do think about what might be relevant, useful, impactful in that policy context. Similarly, for the impact delivery, you'll be asked to complete an impact statement, demonstrate the relevance to the UN SDGs and also the knowledge transfer. So again, think about who are the stakeholders I'm trying to provide evidence for impact and consult in my project and consider how they will be impacted and how you can facilitate knowledge transfer to them as part of your proposal. So again, just don't leave this as an afterthought. I mentioned earlier on that there's some additional requirements just around generative AI in this year's call. This guidance has been compiled as part of a group of funding organisations in Ireland. So we are trying to take a harmonised approach to this. It's quite light touch at this stage, but there may be further developments in the future around this. Also, it's very much a live issue, as I'm sure you're aware, and we're also engaged in a number of European initiatives on this. So as an applicant, you will be asked to declare in the online application whether you have used any generative AI tools. And when I'm speaking about generative AI, I'm referring to large language models such as ChatGPT, Microsoft Copilot, Google Gemini and other tools. If you've used any of these tools in your application, you will be required to specify which tools and versions you've used and to what extent. And this information will be made visible to the evaluators of your proposal. But just to note that evaluators will not be permitted to use generative AI in order to make sure that they're adhering to EPA's confidentiality requirements. Upload of information submitted as an application would not be permitted to be, or to a generative AI tool would not be permitted. So they're precluded from use of generative AI in their role. So just to sum up, for the application process, review your call documentation in detail. I think I've emphasized that a few times. Leave sufficient time to complete all the templates and the online fields. Make sure you're submitting a high quality application, so take the time to do that. Make sure to submit before the deadline. I know it seems obvious, but there is absolutely no flexibility about this. This is automatically imposed, and we do not accept any applications after the deadline. And applications will be evaluated based on the information in your submission. So if there's anything that you feel you want to change after the submission, unfortunately, that will not be permitted. And finally, just to note that the deadlines, the technical queries deadline. So if you do have queries around the scope of any of the topics, they should be submitted by email to research@epa.ie, and this must be done before the 22nd of May. The submission deadline is the 29th of May, and then the approval deadline for the authorisers to submit your proposal to the EPA is the 5th of June, all of these being at 4 o'clock Irish Standard Time. The evaluation period will then run across the summer, and we would hope to notify all applicants of the outcome of the call in October of this year, before we then enter into negotiation with the successful applicants and projects being commenced in sort of Q1, Q2 of 2026. So I'll be happy to take questions at the end of the session, but in the meantime, I'm going to pass it over to Damien from Smith & Williamson, who's going to talk us through some of the financial rules and eligibility requirements.
Great, thanks, Dara, and good morning, everybody, and welcome on a bright and sunny Wednesday morning. I suppose for the eagle-eyed amongst you who would have attended one of these webinars previously, a lot of the faces on the screen there are the same, and the names. However, the name of the firm has changed, and a bit like Trigger's brush, we've a new handle and new brush, but the brush remains the same. So just a change of name, the people and the faces are the same. You probably would have remembered us as Evelyn Partners or Smith & Williamson previously. So as Dara mentioned, our role is to support the EPA in terms of the financial aspects of the EPA research call for 2025. And we have a team of very experienced advisors who assist us in doing that. Their names are there on the screen. And for those of you who are already participating in the research program or have done in the past, some of those names will be familiar. And as you progress through the funding cycle of your project, once successful, those names and faces will become very familiar to you in terms of your journey through the application process and the certification process. So just next slide, Eamon, if you can. What we'd like to do is answer some questions, and hopefully these are questions which will help you in terms of creating your application. And what we want to try and do is ensure that from your perspective, you have a comprehensive application which meets all of the eligibility criteria from a financial perspective, which means that your pathway through the application process can be as smooth and as efficient as possible, and present you with the least headaches or inconveniences. So that's our objective today. So hopefully by the end of this session, we'll have done that. The first question we want to answer is who can apply for funding. So if we go to the next slide, please, Eamon. And the next one, and again, we have on this slide what looks like a very busy table, but if we go from left to right, you'll see that what we've tried to do here is summarize both the type of projects that can be funded under the research program, typically the ticket size of those projects in terms of what potentially is available in monetary terms to fund those projects, the duration of them, and obviously then the makeup of the research team as to how that team can be constructed, all within the guidelines of the research program. So you'll see the project type ranges from doctoral scholarships right up to large-scale studies, ticket size of 136,000 to in excess of 1.3 million, and typically the duration of projects can range from anywhere from 6 months, where we're dealing with a desk study, right up to obviously 60 months, where potentially we're dealing with a capability development project. One common thing you'll see there in terms of the lead applicant, and Dara mentioned this in his section of the presentation, is that the lead applicant or host organisation for the project must be located on the island of Ireland. And there's very sound logic behind that. One of the fundamental principles of the research program is that it creates and enhances the research capacity on the island of Ireland, and for that reason, lead applicant organisations must be located on the island of Ireland in the first instance. Across the type of projects, you'll see that there are some projects which permit or allow co-applicants, so a consortium of lead applicant and one or more than one co-applicants to deliver the research project. However, there are some where it's only anticipated that the applicant would be the lead applicant, and there wouldn't be a requirement or need for co-applicant to participate in a consortium also. In terms of the host organization, it's important to establish which category of host organization you fall into within the parameters of the research program. So there are a number of those categories, and I'll briefly refer to some of them. Some of them very straightforward and self-explanatory, some less so perhaps. So HEI, or higher education institutions, most organizations or most people within HEI organizations will be very familiar with that definition. RPO, or research performing organization, is a very specific type of organization, and that can be confusing for some applicants who may be of the view that they are, or their organization meets the requirement in terms of a research performing organization. But it's a very specific definition, and it's detailed in the glossary of terms and the guidelines, and I'd refer you to that. But briefly, it means that an organization engaged in publicly funded research, which represents approximately 50% of their annual capacity. So that's a key definition. There are some other elements to the criteria to determine if you are an RPO, but that's probably the headline criteria that you have to meet. Then we've obviously got private companies, which can be small, medium, or large, and we'll see in a bit that depending on whether you are S or M or L in that cohort can impact on the amount of funding that's available. Non-government organizations, public benefit entities or charities. And again, it's important to establish which one of those your organization falls into, because that can impact the level of funding that is available. So that's just a brief summary in one slide of those key elements of the program. If we move to the next slide, please. We'll probably dig a little bit deeper into those organization types. Sorry, if we can go back there, please, Eamon. Yeah. If we look now at each of those types or categories of organizations, we'll see what that means or what the implications are for the funding rate that's available to that organization. So if we take at a very high level, this, I suppose, the most straightforward, if you're a publicly funded HEI, higher education institution, then essentially you can avail of a maximum funding rate of 100%. So in very simple terms, that means if your project budget is 100,000 of cost and you ultimately spend that 100,000, then the EPA can reimburse you 100,000 euros, assuming all of that expenditure meets the eligibility criteria. If you're a public or state body, again, similar to HEI, 100% funding is available. Again, research performing organization, subject to meeting the definition, which I would refer to you if you're in any doubt. Again, there's 100% funding available to that. And then we're into that SML, or small, medium, large company. So if your organization is a small company or enterprise, and as you can see, the definition there is less than 50 employees and one of either turnover below 15 million or balance sheet of less than 7.5 million. If you meet that criteria, then you can avail of 80% funding. So to go back to a very simple example, again, your budget is 100,000 euros for the project. You spend ultimately 100,000 euros, then you can receive up to 80% of that, or 80,000 euros in funding towards the cost of your project. Again, as you move up through those definitions, you can see the criteria and the parameters change. Do pay particular attention to those if you are a corporate applying for funding, because those definitions did change midway through last year. They actually were lower in terms of the small company exemption. So again, that may mean that the program for small companies may be more attractive than it was last year, and certainly for medium also. So those rates will have improved based on the criteria change. And then NGOs, public benefit entities, and charities tend to be captured in one category, and they can be funded up to a maximum of 95%. So again, quite a high level of funding available there, but not quite 100%. And again, the formal or legal definitions of all of these terms can be found in the glossary, which is at the back of the guidelines and terms and conditions. So I would draw your attention to that. So Eamon, if we can go to the next slide, please. So now that we know who can apply for funding and some of the funding that's available, let's talk a little bit about the categories of expenditure that are eligible for funding. So if we go to the next slide, before we look at the principles here, and there are 9 principles there, it's important to maybe emphasize what one of the I suppose fundamentals of the EPA research program is, and that is that it funds what we call not-for-profit public good research. And very simply, what that means is that it's not a funding mechanism that organizations are intended to profit from. The principle is merely to reimburse organizations so that they are not out of pocket as a result of participating in the program, subject to the maximum funding levels that are available. So obviously, if you are in the category that you can be funded 100%, then essentially you should be reimbursed 100% of the incremental cost of participating in this program. However, if you're funded up to 80%, then you'll be funded or reimbursed for 80% of the incremental cost, and there will be, yes, a cost to your organization of that shortfall of 20%. But it is important to emphasize that the program will fund the incremental cost of your project. So a very simple thing that we always say is that if there is any element of your costs which are essentially recurring, and if the project didn't proceed, you would still have to incur those costs, then generally speaking, it's safe to say that that wouldn't be an eligible cost item. So what we're talking about here are costs that are driven wholly and exclusively by the project. So in order to assess that in a little bit more detail, we've identified these 9 principles which should help you identify whether the costs that you anticipate may be incurred as a result of the project are eligible for funding under the program guidelines. So they must be actual. So that's very simple. We can't have fictitious or estimates. They must be real costs, reasonable and wholly necessary. And again, reasonableness is something that we take a view on when we look at all of these projects at the application stage. And again, that's what the typical man or woman on the street would determine as reasonable. So, to give you one extreme example, if you have travel and subsistence costs, first class flights are not reasonable. Although I'm sure everybody would like to be able to take first class flights, but they're not reasonable, nor are 5-star hotels reasonable use of public sector funds. So just to give you a little bit of balance to that. Incurred and paid during the project term. So this is absolutely vital in terms of your ability to maximize the drawdown of the grant available to you. There are 2 key dates in any grant agreement, and that is the start date that the grant is awarded on and the project is approved from, and the planned or grant agreed end date of that project. Any expenditure between those 2 dates is fair game. And once it meets the criteria and has been spent wholly and exclusively for the purpose of the project, then that means it's reasonably good chance that it can be funded by the project. However, if your expenditure has been incurred outside of those 2 key dates, then unfortunately it can't be funded as part of the program. So very important that you don't get ahead of yourself in terms of the application process and decide to jump the gun and start perhaps buying equipment or putting in place some resources that you will need because you're very confident that you will get approval from the EPA. Safe to say those costs will not be funded and will not be eligible. So the cost again must be solely to advance the project. And again, that's goes on from that principle that we say earlier on, that if the project isn't to or wasn't to progress, would these costs be incurred? If the answer is no, then it's likely they are or do meet that criteria. The next panel there is in accordance with your usual accounting principles. And again, that's something your finance officer, finance team will maybe be able to advise you. But again, if it's your normal accounting principle to use public sector travel and subsistence rates, then absolutely they're the rates that you should use for the purpose of your budget or your expected expenditure. If it's to use some other methodology, then you should obviously engage with them to understand what that is. The costs must be, as well as actual, they must be real, must be recorded in your accounts, exclude any profit margin. And again, that's important in the sense that, as we said, one of our building blocks for the EPA research program is that it funds not-for-profit research. So this form of funding is not meant to be any sort of seed capital funding or startup funding. This is wholly focused and very targeted funding at research and developing and creating research capacity. And that's not for profit research. So to that end, it shouldn't include a profit margin. The next panel beside it is not otherwise available and accessible. So essentially, if there are facilities or equipment or access to expertise that's available or accessible within your organization, then it's generally expected that you wouldn't be buying in or bringing in those resources or that equipment, let's say. So if there is a key piece of equipment that is required for your research project, and there are 5 of those specific items of equipment available within your research performing organization or HEI, then clearly it would be expected that they would be available to you. And then finally, to finish this slide, be of a type normally charged to research projects. So, this can throw up some very extreme examples, but what you would typically expect to see on a science-based funded research project are things like staff costs, things like consumables, things like research focused equipment, things like perhaps external assistance in terms of technical expertise. But you wouldn't expect a research project to be buying flat screen TVs or PlayStations or Game Boys. So some extreme examples there, but we do look for outliers in terms of the types of expenditure and categories of expenditure that are included. So the culmination of all that is, if you can answer yes to all of these questions, then if you have any doubt as to whether your cost can be eligible to include in your budget, then the answer is probably yes, unless it is specifically identified as ineligible within the guidelines, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So, Eamon, if you could maybe go to the next slide. So as we alluded to a little bit there, what you'll see across the screen there are the types or categories of expenditure that we would typically expect to see on an EPA funded research project. So staff costs, travel and subsistence consumables, external facilities, and then you'll see this category called overheads, which is basically 30% of modified costs. So talk about that in a little bit. Equipment, external assistance. So that's generally expertise or resources that aren't available within your research team. And what I mean by research team there is very important, because if you have a consortium application, as in there is a lead applicant and 1 or 2 or perhaps a number of co-applicants, then if that external expertise is available within your consortium of partners, then clearly those partners should be providing that expertise and you shouldn't need to buy in. And then finally, we have communication costs. The reason we've called out or spotlighted some of those in green is that depending on your location in terms of the location of you as an applicant or co-applicant organization, if you are located on the island of Ireland, then all of those categories of expenditure are eligible. However, if you're not located on the island of Ireland, again, there are restrictions in terms of the categories of expenditure that you can apply for funding in respect of. So if we look at staff costs, for example, in terms of applicants not on the island of Ireland, then the cost of staff must be additional, as in they must be staff recruited specifically for the purpose of the project and can't be permanent members of staff or core members of staff. And then obviously there are other costs associated with staff costs which are not eligible, such as training, stipends, postdoc salary, student fees, pension and social costs again are also excluded. So important if you are an applicant organisation or co-applicant not located on the island that you pay particular attention to the categories of expenditure which are not available to you. So across to the extreme right there, you'll see equipment, external assistance and communication costs. Again, if you're not located on the island of Ireland, those categories are not available to you, but the other costs are. And maybe just to focus on the overhead costs. So the EPA research program absolutely accepts that in carrying out or performing a research project, there is an overhead element to that. And effectively, rather than have applicant organizations have to justify or submit detailed records and supporting documentation in terms of overheads, there's an accepted flat rate of 30% of modified costs. So that 30% of modified costs is effectively 30% of staff, travel and subsistence, consumables, and other facilities. So again, you'll see from the budget template that you'll have to complete as part of the application process, that figure will be automatically calculated for you, so you don't really have to worry about it, but useful to understand where it comes from. And that's typically to reimburse you for, I suppose, the indirect costs of operating a research project. And that's the very simple things like the light and heat, keeping the lights on, the insurance, rent and rates, general overhead rates of running any organization which is performing research. So again, lots to consider in there. But as you can see, we've tried to simplify it in some respects by building in some automatic features into the budget facility, which will make some of this a little bit more easier, simpler when you're going through the process. So if we go to the next slide, if we can, please. So maybe just to focus on some of the categories of application or applicant and understand a little bit more about what is fair game and what's not in terms of their cost profile. So if we talk about HEIs, public or state bodies and RPO, and we put them into that bucket because they're all eligible for 100% funding. So that makes things easy, and it's almost a uniform approach in terms of their eligibility rules. So for those organizations, only the cost of additional staff are eligible for funding. And again, because all of those organizations are either exclusively funded or substantially funded by public sources, then there are restrictions in terms of the funding of those core staff or permanent staff from public sector funding. So in terms of resourcing your project, if you are recruiting additional staff to form part of the research team that don't form part of the headcount or the core funding of your organization, then they're absolutely eligible. Again, up to your funding rate, which in this case for this cohort is 100%. The salary costs includes what we call the statutory costs associated with that, and that's the employer's PRSI and employer pension contributions where relevant. And again, there are quite detailed guidance within the terms and conditions and guidelines around pension, and we encourage you to maybe look at that because there's been obviously a lot of discourse and I suppose confusion around pensions in HEIs and public sector bodies. So please do talk to your research finance or finance team about that when collating your budget for your project. The rates of pay that the EPA research program will fund are in accordance with the IUA pay scale. Those pay scales are available on both the EPA's research program website or also on the IUA website. And that sets out the pay scales across various grades of researchers. right out to 2026, 2027. So you'll see that those rates provide for national pay awards and increments out to 2027, which will be very useful in preparing your budget. So please do make sure that you use those as the basis for including or calculating your staff costs for your project as part of your budget. In all cases, the costs should be based on the payroll records of your organization. So ultimately, whatever rates you include in your budget, ultimately we'll expect those to be reflected in the payroll when that person comes on stream and forms part of your organization. So again, just be mindful of that. Where you're not sure what staff where you haven't identified the staff for your project at the budget stage, then please do just use the grades per the IUA rates as the basis of your budget. And just to call out in terms of PhD or master's students, the stipend there, following a review by the EPA last year, was increased from 18,500 to 25,000. And again, that's in line with the program for government, and in some respects, it's gone ahead of the program for government. And obviously, that funding is available up to 25,000. The amounts for fees in respect of PhD or masters is capped at 5,750. So please do be mindful of those when preparing your budget. So maybe to look at some of the differences then for other categories of organizations. So again, as we mentioned, if you're not located on the island of Ireland, then there's restrictions in terms of the costs that are eligible. So similar to HEIs and public sector bodies, the cost of only additional staff are eligible. So that's really important to be mindful of. And then we mentioned some of those costs which can't be funded. So do be mindful of those. On the right of that screen, you'll see there's private entity organizations. And again, these are SMEs located on the island of Ireland, and that can also be PBEs, public benefit entities, or charities. And in those instances, the cost of permanent staff can in fact be funded because obviously the source of funding for those organizations is generally not public funding. The salary costs that are eligible are in respect of can also include admin and supervisory staff if they don't form part of your overheads. So again, that may be eligible for funding. Again, those costs must be based on the actual salary cost per your payroll records. And this is, I suppose, quite important because we do see quite a number of applications each year where the co-applicant organization is an SME, and they include their staff costs at what we call a consulting rate as opposed to their actual pay rate. So, as I said, these research projects are not meant to deliver any element of profit to participants. So, if you are employing someone on a salary of 30,000 euros plus employer's PRSI plus pension, then that's your cost for that individual, or that's the basis that you use for the cost. If they're an engineer that you outsource to other organizations and you charge those other organizations a multiple of their salary costs, that's not the rate that you can use for the purpose of this project. It's the actual cost to your organization of employing them. For private entity organizations, pension contributions are not eligible because they're contributions to private pension funds, and that's prohibited from public sector funding. So unfortunately, they can't be funded. And we do see from time to time applications from sole traders. So the definition of a small, medium, large entity is not restricted to just corporate structures. So if you're in a non-corporate structure, you may still meet the definition of a small or medium enterprise is the word as opposed to company or corporate. And again, there are some particular requirements or some particular criteria around that in respect of salary costs or staff costs for those individuals, because you may not actually draw a salary from your organization. So that's one to come and talk to us about as part of the application process. So just to the next slide, if I may, Eamon. So just to talk, I suppose, quickly about costs which are not eligible. And the next slide. Some of these are common sense, and I suppose, flow directly from some of the principles that we talked about earlier in the slides. And again, you'll see lots of words out there which are very self-explanatory. So you'll see words such as perks or benefit in kind. Again, they're not eligible. Hospitality, sick pay, marketing subscriptions, redundancy payments, unnecessary expenditure, recruitment costs, all of these in that word bubble there are specifically called out as ineligible. But if we go to the next slide and maybe talk about some of those in particular. And as I said, some of these are very straightforward and self-explanatory, but maybe to spotlight some of them. We mentioned private pension schemes, fortunately can't be funded. Entertainment or hospitality is identified as ineligible. However, there can be circumstances where it's wholly and exclusively necessary. So if you have got a consortium meeting of your research partners, and obviously you're attending a workshop, and there is tea, coffee, and biscuits as a result of that entertainment obviously can be included. Sick pay or redundancy can't be funded as a direct cost. It is funded indirectly through the overhead costs, and the overhead costs has been set at a level of 30% to cover a lot of these indirect costs that arise as a result of participating in a research project. BIVA type normally charged to research projects we talked about, bonus payments, and then one, I suppose, particular shout out to one of the items on the list there is the vouchers as a means of payment. And I suppose this is one area where there is, I suppose, a different view from participants in the research program and obviously funders. But from a funder's perspective, using gift vouchers or or vouchers in lieu of payment as a means of payment presents a particular challenge in terms of verifying the eligibility of those costs. So that can be particularly challenging, and that's been particularly called out in the guidelines this year. Unnecessary or ill-considered expenditure. So as we mentioned, if there is expenditure which is not wholly necessary for the project, then that will be deemed ineligible for funding. And subscriptions, memberships, or affiliation fees, maybe just to finally mention that one. If you are participating in the project and your area of expertise or specialism is perhaps, say, engineering, and you are a member of the IEA, I think is the affiliated body, Institute of Engineers in Ireland, then typically you will pay your subscription and your membership fees every year. But those subscriptions and membership fees will be paid irrespective of whether you participate in this funding program or not. So therefore, they're not wholly necessary. So from that perspective, those subscriptions or membership fees would not be eligible. However, if as part of your research project, you have to join a particular specialist group because they have access to information or material that will be wholly relevant to your project. And in order to gain access to that, you have to join that research group or become an affiliate member of that research group, then that subscription or membership fee can be eligible in those instances. So again, just to pay particular attention to the guidelines in terms of the list of ineligible expenditure. So yeah, if we can move on to the next slide, Eamon. And just to mention some changes from the previous call, and again, the next slide, sorry, just go back one, I think. Yep. And again, each year as part of the research program, the EPA carries out a review of the previous call, and I suppose the impact of that in terms of the throughput, in terms of take up of projects and the quality of applications and projects coming through, and obviously looks to see ways to improve the call on an incremental basis going forward. And again, in terms of what's changed from 2024, there are some changes, but for those of you who have participated in the previous call or are familiar with the EPA research program, these changes are very much evolution as opposed to revolution. So they're slight incremental changes, And in some cases, they're not changing at all. What we've really done is just, I suppose, placed heavier emphasis on some of the eligibility criteria or guidelines, which was always in the call, but perhaps wasn't explicitly highlighted as well as it should be. So what we've tried to do here is call out some of those to re-emphasize them again to participants in the program. So the first one we mentioned previously in terms of the small company thresholds have changed, so please do watch for that. We've talked about the use of vouchers as a means of payment. That's specifically spotlighted in the guidance document now. Payments of a contribution to private health or medical insurance is specifically called out as ineligible. And I suppose that can come up from time to time and can arise in certain circumstances, perhaps where you are bringing in researchers from outside the jurisdiction, and particularly outside the European Economic Area, where there may be a requirement to for them to put in place private health or medical insurance, but unfortunately from a funding program perspective, that can't be funded. Applicants not located on the island of Ireland, we continue to have applications from applicants outside of Ireland, and I suppose we continue to see applications where the costs of permanent staff or existing staff are included. And we've just tried to really emphasize that in the document this year to avoid that, I suppose, uncertainty or issue coming up through the evaluation and the application process. We've also called out access charge plan rates, and I suppose this is specific or particularly relevant to HEIs who perhaps have in place access charge plan rates for research infrastructure. And again, I suppose they were designed with a particular purpose in mind and a particular funding program in mind, which isn't entirely aligned with the EPA's, and therefore we've called out some of the particular requirements of the EPA research program in respect of those costs, which you should consider if you propose to include those in your budgeted costs. Costs of travel visas to attend conferences for the purpose of the project are called out as eligible. And why is that? Well, there's two types of visas that we typically see in the cost profile or budget profile of projects. There may be, in terms of recruiting new staff members, a work visa requirement, which is specifically called out as ineligible, and important to mention the distinction between the two. Whereas if you have a research team and they have to travel to an international destination and there's a requirement to have a temporary visa in order to attend that conference, then that cost will be eligible, but costs associated with employment of staff is not eligible, as that's deemed to be covered by the overhead allocation. And then finally, to mention subcontract arrangements, if there are consortium applications from multiple applicants, it's very important to bear in mind that for the EPA research program, you can either be a lead or co-applicant, but you can only be one or the other. And what we're saying there really is that if you're a lead or co-applicant, then you can't also be a subcontractor or external assistant to the project. So what that means is if I'm a lead partner or a co-applicant partner, then all my costs are my staff costs, my consumables, etc. But then I can't appear on the budget profile of another applicant within the organization, which lists me as a external assistance or a subcontract partner also. So you're either an applicant, be it lead applicant or co-applicant, or a subcontractor, but you cannot be both. So again, just to re-emphasize that. And then finally, the next slide, Eamon, if I can, lessons learned. And again, the next slide, please. Sorry, just one back. Again, these are some of those other learnings that we took from the previous call and some of the feedback that we listened to from applicants both in terms of the application process and then throughout the year in terms of the claim process. The budgeted costs for your project, it's very important that you recognize that the costs that you include in monetary terms. So if you're planning that the budgeted cost for your project is 100,000 euros, then the expectation is that you will spend 100,000 euros. If you spend less than 100,000 euros, then the amount of funding available to you is in proportion to what you've actually spent, not what was budgeted. So the budgeted cost and the funding rate are inextricably linked and really important to understand as over the life cycle of your project that you get those right. They won't change, but the obligation from the EPA is to fund up to that budgeted costs at the appropriate funding rate. And where that changes, the funding rate will be applied to the lower number, which could result in the ultimate grant awarded or grant payable to you as being less than what you may have expected. Salary costs we've mentioned quite a lot, so I'm not going to dwell on that. Budget increases, it's really important to mention that the budget that you submit at the application stage, it's effectively in terms of the total envelope or the maximum amount of expenditure you plan on the project. This is effectively, you get one shot at this, so it's important to get it right. As you go through the evaluation process, there may be questions about your budget. However, there is no opportunity or no possibility of increasing the overall project cost during that evaluation process. So once it's submitted, and if you have a budget increase which says that the total cost for your project is going to be, again, to use a very simple number, 100,000 euros, if there are changes needed on foot of the negotiation process, having gone through that evaluation process, then the budget must be managed within that overall of 100,000. There isn't any scope to increase that at that stage of the process. And then number 4 there in terms of status change, again, there have been instances throughout the evaluation process where applicants have misinterpreted their status and have sought to change their status. And just to say that that's exceptionally difficult from an EPA perspective to do in terms of both the system and obviously the guidelines. So that only happens and rarely happens, but only in exceptional circumstances. So please do speak to your organization and any representatives for your co-applicant organizations, if in a consortium, to fully understand your status and what that means for you in terms of the funding rules and the eligibility rules in terms of your cost profile. And then in respect of payroll records, throughout the life of the project, you will be required to provide payroll records for staff who are included in your research team and the costs of which you are seeking reimbursement for. And it's called out in the guidelines and terms and conditions that it's important that you get the consent of all team members to provide that information to the EPA or its advisors over the life of the project, because that is one of the key documents we use to ensure that the pay costs are eligible in respect of the project post award. And I suppose just to mention subgrants, we did have 1 or 2 instances in the previous round of funds where applicants had provided for subgrants to other or subawards to third-party organizations or other organizations as a feature of their proposal. Suffice to say that that's not an option available within the guidelines and the eligibility rules of the EPA research program. The only way that could be accommodated and the way that the EPA research program is structured is that the only subawards that can be made are in respect of co-applicants. So you can either be an applicant or a co-applicant, but applicants cannot then onward fund other third-party obligations who are not part of the project consortium. So conscious of time and want to leave some time for questions. So I'll come back to you, Dara, if that's okay from
Yeah, thanks a million, Damien, for that overview of the funding eligibility. Look, loads of detail in there, so I would advise people that slides will be made available for their review, and obviously then the guidelines, terms and conditions, particularly for those of you in the higher education institutions, but also those of you in the private sector, do engage with your finance offices very closely on preparing your budget to make sure that your costs are eligible and in line with the T's and C's. So I think without further ado, we might stop sharing our screen and I don't know, Amy, can you stop sharing there maybe? And we might try to rattle through the questions that we've received so far. So I will start at the top of the questions that we've received. So as a lead applicant that may have identified two subject areas that can be addressed by two different researchers, can two applications be submitted by the same applicant or organisation? Yes, an applicant can submit more than one application, but that application must be to two different call topics. You can't submit a single, more than one application to the same call topic, but you can submit to multiple call topics. I would advise people who may be looking at multiple applications to consider this very carefully, to have a strong application against the most suitable call topic. And I would also advise you that if you're successful, you would be expected to be able to deliver both or more projects. So please engage again with your research offices before considering multiple applications. It should be undertaken carefully. In slide 36, so it's the next question, highlighting different award categories. Can you elaborate on the no co-applicant permitted for the research fellowship category? There's no research fellowships permitted under this call, so it's not relevant in this context. But typically you wouldn't have a co-applicant under a research fellowship, but not permitted under our current call. Can you clarify the funding rate for a consortium that includes a HEI as a lead applicant and a small, medium-sized company as a partner? Damien, do you want to briefly cover this one?
Sure, Sarah, yeah. I think what you'll see when you actually go to the application process in terms of the budget template, the funding rate is specific to each individual category. So the HEI will attract a funding rate of 100%, and the SME, depending on whether they're SM or L, sorry, their funding rate will be 80%, 75%, or 65%. But when they put in their particular category, when they define themselves as their applicant type, the funding rate will be calculated for them. So you'll see from the budget template that's very straightforward once you get in there. And the amount of funding that's awarded is a combination or a culmination of those factors.
Perfect. Thanks a million. I think it'll make a lot more sense if you look at the templates, as Damien has said. The next question, I think maybe for you as well, Damien, a further education college would that be eligible as a lead applicant or a partner in an application?
I'm going to say I don't believe so. So the definition of a lead applicant is HEI and RPO on the island of Ireland, and I think for higher education institutions that's defined by the Higher Education Act. So that sets out the named institutions that fall into that category. So my immediate reaction would be no, but do refer to the guidelines. But I would think not.
Yeah, and that's absolutely fine. If those people are engaging with a research project, they can of course be included as a non-funded partner that would be named on the project if there's some educational aspect that they're being engaged with on, but as Damien said, not as a co-applicant or lead applicant. I think you covered this in the presentation, Damien, but we have a question about the higher education pension contribution situation, and does this need to be included, and can the funding be ring-fenced and used? I think no change is kind of the answer, but
yeah, no news. No news, I'm afraid. The position hasn't changed, so it can still be included in the budget for your project. However, it is ring-fenced and can't be used for other purposes, and I suppose the budget template, that'll become self-apparent or explanatory when you go to fill it in, but I suppose the quick answer is no change on that front.
Great, thanks. The next question I think I've addressed around candidates applying for more than one topic. Yes, you can, but please do it carefully and under advisement. You will need the capacity to address those if you're successful in multiple topics. And please concentrate on doing one really good application if possible. The next one, HEIs in the north of Ireland, are they held to IUA rates, salary rates, and PhD stipends, Damien?
I'll take the second part first because that's quite easy and straightforward. In terms of the PhD stipend and fee rates, they're capped at 25,000 and 5,750. So there's no scope to go beyond those figures. If the rates in the north of Ireland are lower, then you should use those rates as your actual rates. In terms of the IUA rates, fully appreciate that that's not necessarily a requirement in the north. So in that instance, you should use your actual pay rates for your organization. So if you are in a HEI in the north of Ireland, then please do talk to your payroll office for the relevant rate for the particular category of researcher that you're proposing.
Great, thanks a million. The next question, can you have collaborators or co-applicants from the UK and Southeast Asia, but planning to hire a research assistant based in Ireland at the host institution? I'm not sure I fully understand that question, but the lead applicant does need to be based in Ireland, on the island of Ireland, at a host institution there. Yes, you can have a co-applicant, an international co-applicant, but I think Damien covered off in his presentation, and do look at our terms and conditions about what eligible costs there would be for international applicants. And again, for this, I would strongly encourage you to engage with your host institution. They will be required to put research agreements in place with co-applicants. So they should be supportive of any of these kinds of arrangements. Anything you want to add to that, Damien?
No, I think you're right. But I suppose if the question is if you have if you are a lead applicant based on the island of Ireland and you plan to hire a research assistant and they will be employed by the host institution and based in Ireland, then that cost can be eligible. That meets the criteria. But if the question is can they be from outside of Ireland, then no, they can't.
Perfect. And I suppose just to be absolutely clear on this, if the person is being hired in Ireland, that should be part of the work packages, etc., being led by the Irish applicant. I just want to make sure that people aren't trying to kind of find imaginative solutions to funding of additional resources outside of Ireland. So do consider that. And as I'm constantly saying, do talk to your research office and your finance offices for advice to ensure that they're happy with any arrangements that you're considering. Is alignment with EU policies encouraged or viewed favourably in the evaluation? Absolutely. I mean, when we're looking at national policies, nearly all of our national policies are informed by EU directives and policies. So consideration of EU policy context is important. I would encourage people to also consider what the impact of that EU policy is at a national level in consideration of their proposal. The next question is it possible to have a postdoc working in a collaborating university in the UK, or does the postdoc need to be located in Ireland? Pass that over to you, Damien.
I suppose in terms of the funding of a postdoc, if it's a postdoctoral award, then they should be located on the island of Ireland. However, if you're using a postdoctor as part of a research team on a medium or large scale, and some element of that work requires them to relocate to a UK collaborating university, then that can be funded. But if there is a postdoctorate award being funded, then they should be located on the island of Ireland.
Great, thanks for that. The next one's also for you. We have the pay scales out to June 2026, but are applicants permitted to include reasonable annual increases on the basis of future inflation?
I suppose the quick answer to that is no. Unfortunately, we can't include inflationary increases. I suppose that obviously the expectation is that there won't be further pay awards in the foreseeable future, at least not beyond, or not until 2026. But for the purposes of the current program, there's no facility to apply an inflationary increase beyond those IOA pay scales.
That's great. Thank you. The next question is around postdocs being a co-applicant and whether that is permitted. I do think that's slightly, we have to be careful in answering that question, and I would encourage people to read the FAQ around people on temporary contracts being included as an applicant or a co-applicant. I suppose the short answer is, in principle, yes. An appropriate post, a person on an appropriate contract, temporary contract can. That would typically be a research fellow or a senior research fellow who has the appropriate expertise to do so, but also would have the support of their institution as an independent researcher to apply and to hold a grant. So any of those kinds of considerations, again, engage early with your research office. They would be required to support you in any such application, and you should have the prerequisite experience such to manage and lead an award. Anything you want to add to that, Damien?
No, I suppose just to say that generally, from a program perspective, we don't fund individuals. So, each individual researcher must, as you said, there have the support of their host institution, and it's the host institution that actually makes the application. It's in the name of the host institution, and the grant resides with the host institution, not with the individual. So just to bear that in mind.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks. We have a question just around the lead applicant moving between HEIs before the start or during the course of the project. We recognise that people will change jobs, and that's just the nature of all of our lives. So if that happens, you will need to engage with us on that. You shouldn't advise us of any change unless like before the end of the evaluation process. But if you are successful, you should advise us at that point, or during the course of the project, you should also advise us. I would say that we will have to engage with the relevant host institutions to confirm that, both the departing institution and the accepting institution, that, as Damien emphasised there, they're the holders of the grant and the awards, and so we'll have to have their support. That will also include confirmation that any equipment that's required or access to infrastructure or any other kind of facilities required for execution of the grant are available in the receiving institution. There's a question here on discussing the eligibility requirements of the lead applicant. There's no other additional information there, so I would advise that person just to look more closely at our call documentation and review some of the information that was in the presentation. Next one is on doctoral scholarships. There's no doctoral scholarships under this call, so I won't just discuss this any further, but just to highlight, review the technical call description. There tells you about the project type, and the only project types that are available in this call are desktop studies and medium scale projects. Is there an open topic option this year? No. We have all just topic descriptions as they're set out, and we'd envisage funding one proposal under each of the topics that are there. We may hold additional proposals on a reserve list if we feel they're either providing complementary outputs, or if somebody doesn't accept one of the awards. But otherwise, there are no open topics under this year's call. We're being asked about international academics applying as postdoc for this funding. Not again 100% sure what's meant by that, but I think you should be based in an Irish institution, an institution in Ireland, if you're considering applications to this program. I'm not sure if you see any other interpretation of that, Damien.
The only thing I'd say is I'm not sure if that question is from someone who's part of an existing host institution, but if they're not, obviously they need a host institution sponsor in Ireland who will hold the grant. So I think if that's the case and you have the support of a host institution who are prepared to support your application, then yes, that absolutely can happen. but obviously it's about getting that I suppose collaboration in place with the host institution and agreement first, which may be quite difficult because obviously the funding of that is not certain until the application process and the evaluation process is complete. So there is a degree of uncertainty there. So host institutions would have to consider each one on a case-by-case basis.
Absolutely. Okay, the next one is another one for you. Irish residency permits covered for non-EU postgraduate students, which are covered by other funders such as SFI and SAI. Are they eligible?
Unfortunately, I don't have good news for that question. The answer is no. Costs associated with employing individuals, be they recruitment costs or attendance at interviews or travel to interviews, or indeed travel, visa, or residency permits aren't covered and are specifically identified as ineligible, I'm afraid.
Great, thanks. The next one is about research fellowships not covered by this call. Okay, there isn't a project type covered in this call. Staff funding can be used for any of the positions on the IUA salary scale that goes from research assistants through the postdocs and through the research fellows. You can also apply for other types of staff costs, but if you're considering any of those, please do look carefully at the terms and conditions and the justification required for that and the salary scales. Can you explain whether we can add a co-applicant based outside of Europe to a proposal? Short answer is yes, and I'm not going to elaborate on that more. I would refer to the person to the discussion that Damien provided previously on that. And we're going to have to wrap up in a minute, so we'll just take one or two more. Not sure if it's been answered. If an individual is currently working on part-time hours in a HEI as an academic lecturer, but to do a project, these hours will be increased. I mean, I'm happy for you to address this question if you want, Damien, but there I would really encourage that person to talk to their research office and finance office about their arrangements and their employment arrangements. It really is a matter for the HEI in this case to manage that. I don't know, would you want to add anything to that, Damien?
No, generally just to say that normally where we have part-time academics, then generally they wouldn't be funded on the basis that they're part of the existing headcount for that HEI or RPO. But again, it is, as Dara says, a case of talking to your HR or finance department in terms of your current contractual arrangement, because that's the key for us in terms of establishing the eligibility.
Great, thanks. Okay, number of co-applicants isn't limited, but it should be appropriate for your project. Can bachelors of students apply for this? No. I'm so just trying to get through as many questions as possible here. If a postdoc is already working on a project nearing completion and wants to apply as a co-applicant along with his line manager, yes, that could be permitted. But again, speak with your line manager and also with your research office about the support for your status as a co-applicant to hold to be involved in a grant such as this. And is it one successful proposal per topic? That's certainly our intention, but as I said, we always retain the right to put proposals on a reserve list that are either complementary or that can be used should somebody not accept an award. So that's certainly the design of this year's call. And then finally, if the lead applicant is from Northern Ireland, then the co-applicant from Northern Ireland cannot get funding unless the lead applicant is from Ireland. Is that right? No, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland are treated equivalently. Any organisation on the island of Ireland or any eligible organisation on the island of Ireland can apply as a lead applicant. I think I got that right, Damien.
Absolutely, spot on.
And I think that brings us very much to the end of that. I think we've managed to rattle through all the questions there. If there's anything that isn't addressed either in the webinar, in our documentation or in our FAQs, please do send us an email at research@epa.ie. With that, I'd like to thank all of the attendees, and I'd really like to also thank Damien and Eamon for their support today. And we look forward to some very strong, innovative and interesting applications to the call. Best of luck, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.